Okay. All right, welcome everyone. I'm filling in for Laura today. She couldn't make it. I'm Michael, as you know, and I think everyone knows our special guest, but I'll introduce him briefly before we go. John Wargacki is an assistant professor at Seton Hall University, American literature and poetry. His interests focus on poetry and spirituality, and his forthcoming book is titled One Bridge of Fire, The Rhetoric of Belief in Dickinson, Whitman, Hart, Crane, Stevens, and Eliot. Sounds like a good one. Among his other teaching and scholarly interests are religious and spiritual intersections with literature and the American horror genre. John has spoken in person and virtually many times here, and it's always one of our favorite programs. So without further ado, John Wargacki.
Thank you, Michael. Good to see everybody. Those of you I can see now, I see mainly me and Michael, but I'm sure you can hear me out there. So we've got 4 really good poems, and I have a particular penchant for Emily Dickinson. As some of you know, Dickinson was one of the folks mentioned in that forthcoming book. But what I would like to do, just to kind of set the mood and get things going in terms of our Halloween program, is we're going to start from the bottom and work our way back. And I'd like to go, if Michael, you could share the screen, to go to that 5, it's really not a long poem, but it's 5 short stanzas by Edgar Allan Poe about the spirits. If we can show that poem first. And again, I'm gonna ask for from some help out there, if folks would volunteer to read, and then we'll do what we typically do, which is kind of walk our way through the text and see what kind of poem we have here. I think that in some ways the title speaks for itself, right? Spirits of the Dead. Perfectly appropriate for this time of year. But because they're short, I'm wondering if I can have a volunteer maybe to read just stanzas 1 and 2 and pay particular attention to the imagery. Some of it will seem obvious, of course, but we can talk about the mood that Mr. Poe is setting for us, which is pretty typical for his writing.
Okay. I'll do it.
Yeah. All right.
Okay, so it says, thy soul shall find itself alone midst dark thoughts of the great tombstone, not one of all the crowd to pry into thine hour of secrecy. Be silent in that solitude, which is not loneliness, for then the spirits of the dead who stood in life before thee are again in death around thee, and their will shall overshadow thee. Be still.
Okay, so on the surface of things, we have a Poe poem, which generally means we're going to have something that deals with something creepy or something about spirits. The title rather speaks for itself. But in these first 2 stanzas, Poe surprises us a little bit. Instead of making the graveyard, the great tombstone, into thine hour of secrecy, what does he seem to say in the second stanza? Does anybody see where he's going with this? I mean, how is he framing this concept of loneliness?
Like a reunion?
I think he's saying, may I?
Yes, please. And whoever, I can't see you, so whoever's speaking, if you just tell me what your name, so I can, we can converse.
Sure. I'm Abe Bunis, and I think that he says that the spirits of the dead will prevail in spite of what we do, because we will all join them.
Excellent. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, in fact, go ahead. Someone else wanted to chime in?
Where are you going now?
Oh, somebody's not muted.
I mean, you're going to Maplewood.
Who is that?
Bye, enjoy.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're back to the poem. So yeah, I love that. And I'm sorry, name again, Abe? Was your name Abe?
Yes,
Who
sir.
shared? Yes, Abe. Abe, excellent. If we look at that second stanza, he's telling us right off the bat, right in the second stanza, for then the spirits of the dead who stood in life before thee are again in death around thee. And it's really cool because although Poe's attachment or his Christian denomination is not so relevant here, many of us know that the history of Halloween, the actual title, the word itself, comes from All Hallows Eve, which literally means the day before what was celebrated in the Catholic Church through the Middle Ages, and then in other Christian denominations, hence, as what we think of on November 1st as All Saints Day. And All Saints Day, of course, is a reference to all the departed, without any consideration as to, in the Catholic Church, the saints capitalized means that we presume that they've gone on to an eternal reward. The day that follows is All Souls Day, which means everybody who's departed. So there is that distinction, but I think Poe is getting at that here, that the spirits of the dead who stood in life before thee are again in death around thee, that the spirits haven't really gone. But it's not a poem that posits them in a scary way, but rather that it's almost like a kind of reassuring presence. Who would like to read stanza 3, and we'll continue?
May I read? May I read?
Yes, of course, please.
The night, though clear, shall frown, and the stars shall look not down from their high thrones in the heaven, with light like hope to mortals given. But their red orbs without beam to thy weariness shall seem as a burning and a fever, which would cling to thee forever.
Okay, excellent. And that is the end of stanza 3. So Michael, we could just go back to 3 for a second. Yeah. So now what Poe has done here, which is really cool, is he's incorporated the natural elements. This is sometimes we think of Poe as being in the Romantic period, which again, as I think we've described many times and have been here, a few times before, when we talk about the Romantic period of literature and poetry, we're not just talking about love poems, but we're talking about romantic in the broadest sense. The actual root of the word romantic actually comes to us from the Roman Empire. That's where it comes from, Rome, Roman, romantic. Now, over time, it's been associated with, love poems. But here, what we're really talking about with the Romantic period is the incorporation of all of the natural elements, both on earth, and as you see, he talks about the stars, from their high thrones in heaven, meaning the stars, with light like hope to mortals given, but their red orbs without beam to thy weariness shall seem as a burning and a fever, which would cling to thee forever. So the stars themselves are actually a presence, like a spectral presence, although we think of them as physical and not, spiritual per se. Let's go to the fourth stanza and see where how he's building upon this idea. Yeah, here we go. Yeah, I guess if someone would volunteer just to read the last two, we can talk about them together because they're both so short.
I will. Oh, okay. I will. Oh,
Okay, we have.
okay, go ahead, Myra.
Okay. Now our thoughts thou shalt not banish. Now our visions ne'er to vanish. From thy spirit they shall pass no more, like dewdrop from the grass. The breeze, the breath of God, is still, and the mist upon the hill. Shadowy, shadowy, yet unbroken, is a symbol and a token. How it hangs upon the trees, a mystery of mysteries.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It was read so well. Let's look at the fourth stanza, and then we'll spend a little bit more time on 5, where he really puts it all together. It's a very sophisticated, short little poem. The ideas, on one hand, are very simple. We're in a graveyard, but he's talking about how the presence of those who inhabit the place spiritually are still all around us, that we're not really completely alone. But he repeats that phrase. By the way, the technical term, whenever you repeat a word or a phrase at the start of a poem, some of you may have learned this once upon a time, is with an A. It's called anaphora, anaphora. Poets use this all the time for rhetoric. It's like the way Whitman will say, oh, this, oh, continuing on. But here he does that twice in the first 2 lines of stanza 4. Now our thoughts thou shalt not banish. Now our visions ne'er to vanish. So he's saying, by repeating now are, meaning that they're still with us. Their presence is still here. The emphasis on the word now, that the visions are not going to vanish. Although here he's distinguishing vision from the physical vision to a sort of apparition, what appears to be there. From thy spirit they shall pass, no more like dewdrops from the grass. Now, notice how he brings it all together. I love this. He's speaking about, in some sense, very often in Christianity, the Holy Spirit, the third member of the Trinity, is thought of as the breath of God, right? Even in Genesis, it talks about the breath of God, or in Exodus, when God parted the Red Sea, he said, sent the breath of God was sent out over the water. And this then becomes a very important and salient idea in Christianity. But the breeze here, or he says, qualifies it, the breeze, the breath of God is still. Notice what he's done here that's very interesting. Still can mean that it's not moving anymore. And when you have the breeze, and when you're breathing, obviously that implies motion. But he's using that simple word still in a double sense. On one hand, it's like a paradox. Breath and breeze are still, which basically means you don't have a breeze anymore. And yet simultaneously, he means that it continues to exist, right? Is still here. And the mist upon the hill, and I love the way he repeats, shadowy, yet unbroken. He's really playing with these images against each other. Like what appears to be real is simultaneously a specter, and yet very real at the same time. And then he goes on to say, is a symbol and token, and then wraps it all together in this wonderful phrase, how it hangs upon the trees, a mystery of mysteries. And there he's rhyming trees with mysteries. So saying, at the end of all of this paradox, all of this oxymoronic phrasing, the way we think of the spiritual world with the physical world, at the end of everything is a mystery that we can't explain it. And yet, as a poet, he tries to put it into words. So I would welcome at this point any ideas or thoughts about the poem that maybe you thought of. That's my rendering of it and the way I would talk about it in a classroom, but I'd love to hear from some other folks out there before we move to Ms. Dickinson.
I would like to comment on the repetition of words again. In a mystery of mysteries, it makes the mystery even more mysterious because it repeats them twice, repeats them. And I think that his ending with a mystery means that he hasn't solved anything, nor is he is hoping that his reader may solve something. And
Excellent.
he's dealing with a very holy subject, namely, he's in a sense speaking alongside of God. And when you do something like that, it's rather tenuous. You may be criticized by people who do I think I am? Who do you think you are?
Mhm.
But nevertheless, he is hoping that the average Joe will read this and come across his Poe's attitude and agree with him after giving it due recognition, after thinking about it. It's not something that you read once and throw away. It's something that you come back to over time, and maybe it sinks in.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's a wonderful, wonderful rendering. I'm wondering, Gabe, were you a teacher at one time?
No, but a friend of poetry.
Okay, fair enough. Yes, you clearly have had some experience with this. Yes, yeah. One of the things that I think is wonderful about poetry and literature in general is that it can grapple with the great mysteries, and as you say, a mystery of mysteries, making it even kind of making it more complex. The mystery of mysteries, adding another layer to how mysterious it all is. But at the same time, the effort, the attempt to grapple with the mystery is part of what we do. It's part of human nature. It's why we have philosophy. It's why we have theology. It's why we adhere to our religious traditions. It's why we ponder, the meaning of life. It's what the Greeks did that hundreds, thousands of years ago. Socrates famously saying at his trial, "The unexamined life is not worth living." And he doesn't ever posit that we're gonna find all the answers. I mean, I think we're not gonna find the answers, but we continue to probe. So, wonderful. I thought of this poem as just sort of, we'll work our way through it. And here we are. We just spent like a good chunk of time talking about this wonderful poem by Poe. So let's shift gears a little bit. And yes, did anybody else have a comment they'd like to share? If not, well, I'd like to go to the first poem by Emily Dickinson, which is one of my all-time favorites by her. Because I think in some respects, she's speaking about herself and her view of the world. And remember, we have to go back in time now to the way in which mental illness was thought about in the 19th century. I mean, today, part of our cultural conversation is the challenge of mental illness, depression, all of these different things. You could imagine going back really almost over 150 years, how misunderstood and marginalized people who suffered with these things, these problems were thought about. But I'd like to see how she handles it and how she frames it in this very short 8-line poem, which I find among my favorite. Would somebody like to read that first poem? We don't have titles for her. All her titles are the first line, and they're numbered. Sometimes there's a lot of debate about the actual chronology, but that notwithstanding, let's hear the whole poem. Much madness is divinest sense. Would somebody else like to read that for us?
Yeah, I'll read it.
Sure.
Okay. Much madness is divinest sense to a discerning eye. Much sense, the starkest madness, is the majority in this as all prevail. Assent, and you are sane. Demure, you're straightway dangerous and handled with a chain.
Thank you. Excellent. Yeah, a very appropriate poem for this time of year. Where, when next semester I get to teach a course for senior seminar that I've taught at Seton Hall many times, kind of goes along with all of this. It's called American Horror. And I always distinguish that in the category, when you think of horror, not as a scary, terrifying thing, or something just associated with Halloween, it's a very prominent genre. It's been a prominent genre for centuries. And in American horror in particular, we have two roads that diverge. One is the supernatural dimension, things that like the poem by Poe we just read about the spiritual nature of things. This is everything from The Omen to The Exorcist to, possession to goblins and ghosts, things that go bump in the night. But then there's another dimension to it known as psychological horror. This is what we.
Name, Louis DeJoy.
Okay, I think someone's not muted, but that will hopefully work on that. So one of the interesting facets here is that she's dealing, the next one we will be dealing with the supernatural horror, but in this one she's dealing with the psychological, basically a frame of mind. Notice her first line is such an interesting way of phrasing it. She always uses her first line to throw us off balance. She says, much madness is divinest sense. And then adds right after that, to a discerning eye, meaning that if you look at it very closely, and our assumption is that perhaps she feels that she's looked at this very closely, she's saying that madness is not madness in the way the world typically sees it, but it's actually, notice the superlative adjective she uses, divinest sense, from divine, meaning that, almost godly. Who would like to just share a little bit about that first line and what it might be saying to you? What could she mean when she says much madness is divinest sense?
I think she's speaking about herself. I think that many poets were considered off the wall in those days. What do they talk about? They're talking about stuff I can't understand. So naturally, that there's a certain attribution of idiocy or of madness, as the word is. And I think she is. I think she's talking about herself, that she has the discerning eye, and she is saying, it's not bad. It's okay to be what I am. It's okay to be able to think about these subjects that no one else wants to tackle. And I believe that people who are considered mad are just not understood.
Right. Excellent. Yes.
And she's making a point between being sane and being mad, and how the mad are treated so poorly, and that perhaps being mad is another version of being sane.
Yes, absolutely. Right on it. In fact, in that first line, she's up to something that is very interesting, because by using the superlative form of divine, as though there was a cat, usually we think of divine as a self-defining, to call something divine means to be of God, right? Divinity. We usually don't think of the word as adding, as being displayed to us in the superlative form, as though something could be more divine than something else. Usually when something's divine, that's it. It's like the way we say, we don't qualify the word unique, although we do this all the time, right? It was very unique. Unique literally means it's completely new unto itself. There's nothing to compare it to. But here's what she's up to. She does come from a Protestant Puritan background. I just literally gave a talk on Tuesday at Columbia University about Emily Dickinson and her use of the Jewish technique of Midrash, which is began with the Jewish Bible and now is kind of, a lot of poets work in the Midrashic dimension with these stories. But she's also aware, I think, in her own from her own church experience and from her own reading of the Bible, that one of the definitions of the prophet, going all the way back to the Jewish Bible, is that the prophet was considered to be a little bit mad. that there is a madness to being a prophet, right? There's a lot of quality. Prophet, the prophet can not only see, the prophet not only predicts, the prophet not only has a unique relationship with God, but there was a touch of madness that went with the prophet. And if you see the major prophets of the Hebrew Bible, even up to folks like John the Baptist in the Christian Bible, there is this dimension there. And I think she's very deliberate in using that term. But she does point out, sense in relationship to madness. And then she does a little bit of a corollary move here. Much sense, the starkest madness. Like for some folks, being too sensible is a little bit crazy. Tis the majority. And here she says something I think that is part of the culture, which is true today as it was in her time and maybe even before. It's that sometimes the difference between being sensible, or if you will, she doesn't use the word here, she does use the word sane here at one point, but the difference between madness and sane is often where you are in relationship to the majority, right? When you go along with everybody else, you're considered to be on with the program. So the rest of the poem, as Karen pointed out, 'tis the majority. In this, as all prevail, assent, and you are sane. Meaning, when you go along with the crowd, you're not going to stick out too much. But then she uses that wonderful word demure, meaning, when you go your own way, you're straightway dangerous and handled with a chain. And here, one of the few times
I believe the word is demur, not demure.
Demure, right. There's a couple of ways to think about that. But in any case, the word itself means, to go to she's using it as an oppositional word to assent.
Right. May I ask you about the Midrashic? What did you mean about Midrash? What is the definition of that?
It literally in Hebrew means to investigation. And it's the way in which rabbinical tradition has not changed, but in some cases, they fill in the gaps of certain well-known stories of the Bible. And Midrash has been part of rendering the Jewish Bible for centuries, really going all the way back. There's huge traditions in Midrash, but that's something maybe at some point we could even do an entire talk on for South Orange Public Library. But if you're not familiar with the term, I definitely would recommend checking it out sometime. A lot of for example, I wrote an entire essay once on the way in which Emily Dickinson writes an entire poem about the episode of Jacob wrestling with the angel from the book of Genesis. And it functions very much like a midrash of the story. But that would be a interesting topic at some point, I might say.
These are comments by scholars.
Yes.
As to an analysis of the word. There are many midrashic attempts in the New Testament as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, no, it's certainly it's certainly not limited anymore to the Jewish or Hebrew Bible, although the term itself is rooted in the way those stories were initially treated, and then it's expanded, outward over time. Now poets are working in sometimes I think for Dickinson, though, the term itself, and I mentioned this at Columbia on Tuesday, I'm not sure there's any evidence that she would have even known the word at the time she lived in the 19th century. It's not something that was really explored until about the 20th century outside of a Jewish tradition or a rabbinical tradition per se. But she was doing it nonetheless. I mean, sometimes we're working with different forms and different techniques, even though we may not be aware of it. But excellent. So yeah, so I love this poem because it really is a different way of looking at who is sane and who is not from the point of view of Emily. So shall we move to the next one? This is, again, one now we go from the psychological right into the supernatural. If someone maybe would read the first two stanzas for us.
I will.
Sure, Karen, thank you.
Okay, okay. One need not be a chamber to be haunted. One need not be a house. The brain has corridors surpassing material place. Far safer of a midnight meeting, external ghost, than an interior confronting that whiter host.
Okay, let's stop there for a second. My question would be, what do you see that this poem has in common with the one before it?
Because it's all in the mind. The brain, in other words, you could think about a lot of different things. So it's not confined to a house or an area.
Yes, that opening line, once again, does exactly the thing that I love about Dickinson. She reminds us that one need not be a chamber to be haunted. I mean, we're not just talking about a physical space anymore. And she immediately brings it back into that dimension of madness and sanity, right? That sometimes we can be haunted by our own thoughts, right? So even with what Abe had said earlier about the first poem really speaking about her before it introduces the you, meaning bringing the rest of her readership into this. The same thing is going on here. I love the phrase, the brain has corridors surpassing material space, right? That there's a lot that the mind, one of her other poems, which we're not looking at today, I love this poem. It's a different poem. It's not a Halloween poem, but one of her other poems about the power of the imagination begins with the phrase, the brain is wider than the sky. And I think she's using brain here in the same respect that you have entire endless possibilities that come to us because of the imagination. And she takes it a step further. She's like, we're far safer, perhaps, of a midnight meeting external ghost. Like, I would rather meet a ghost in my room than some of the interior confrontations that whiter ghost, meaning the one that she would have in her head. It's like, I would rather deal with the poltergeist or the visitation from an apparition than some of my own, maybe fears or phobias, and I think we can all relate to that on some level. So shall we continue from here to the end of the poem?
Okay.
Yep.
Should I go? Yeah. Okay. Far safer through an abbey gallop, the stones. A chase. Oh, I can't read it. Oh, a chase. Then moonless, one's own self-encounter in a lonesome place. Ourself behind ourself concealed should startle most. Assassin hid in our apartment be horror's least. The prudent carries a revolver, he bolts the door, or looking a superior specter more near.
Okay, thank you so much, Karen. Michael, I'm just wondering, is there a way to show those last couple of stanzas together, or is it has to be one or the other page?
Let me try.
Oh, excellent, excellent. Yeah. Hopefully you can all still see that fairly well.
Yes.
Yes.
It'll have to be like this.
Now,
Okay, that's okay, because I could read it, and I know it's harder to see, but I could read it and hold them together. So again, she continues. Notice again, we have more in Afro. She starts the second stanza with far safer, and then she continues that thought in the third stanza, far safer through an abbey gallop. And here we're thinking of, perhaps those cloistered places where the monks live, and sometimes, it's a real, the reference, the use of an abbey in this poem is very much a Gothic technique, something we'd see in Poe. but she'd say, I'd rather gallop through an abbey, with these places that are made of stone and stick out on the hillside. It's almost as though she's saying a medieval castle, if you will. The stones of chase, the stone that's made of these cold stones. Then moonless, one's own self encounter in lonesome place, like being alone in the dark by myself. And then she continues, ourself. I love this phrase. You notice how sophisticated it is, even it's in simplicity. Ourself behind ourself concealed. This is right around the time, Freud is positing whenever this was written, it might have been a little bit before, but it won't be long from the time Emily Dickinson's in the middle to the end of her life, she dies in 1886, that Freud is positing his theories about the human mind and about the subconscious. And here she seems to be suggesting that there is a self behind the self, that there's not just the mind and then the exterior self, but that there's places even beneath that. So she's saying our self behind our self concealed should startle most, that when you get deep down into your innermost thoughts, that they could be as terrifying as any castle, they can be as terrifying as any abbey. And then adds, assassin hid in our apartment, be horror's least. Now, I don't know if we'd all agree with that, especially nowadays, but she's saying between the two. And remember, at this time, assassin would not have quite the same sort of meaning in the 19th century as we associate with it today. It's still, it's still a very terrifying idea. However, she's saying that she still prefers the external physical danger to sometimes, the thoughts that are beneath her own thoughts. Again, speaking to the way our imagination can sometimes, frighten one. And then lastly, playing with the idea of the assassin, the prudent, meaning, the wise, the prudent carries a revolver. He bolts the door, or looking a superior specter more near. So saying that, again, I don't think she's being self-referential in that last stanza. I think she's looking at most people protect themselves, they'll have a weapon and bolt the door, but that they overlook a scarier specter who may already be with them, who may already be internalized, that you can't bolt the door against, and that is the human imagination. So what is she suggesting with this poem? Well, I'm open to some ideas. I would just suggest that she's reminding us that sometimes the scariest places are not outside, but they're inside our own imagination, when our own imagination is left to its own devices. Any other thoughts about that poem?
Well, it might have come on the heels of Lincoln's assassination. Because there were very few that I would remember historically.
Mm-hmm.
But I think maybe you can tell us about what it means.
Well, it's very difficult to say. Dickinson only published fewer than 10 poems in her lifetime, and even trying to render them chronologically is scholarly speculation, as we like to say. So clearly, the most famous assassination in the United States, public assassination, would have been President Lincoln's. But as I mentioned, the term assassin, which really goes back to an Arabic word that goes back to a specific incident in the 11th century, which came to exist now in our culture, was not an uncommon term. And especially when we think besides the Lincoln assassination, there were assassins and there were different things going on all through the Civil War from 1861 to 1865. So this would have been a term that I think, again, whatever the actual antecedent for it is, and perhaps we could say for the sake of argument, maybe it's not a specific reference particularly, but I think the larger point she's trying to make is that the physical assassin hid in the apartment, like the one waiting, lurking to get you, she says in the very next line, be horrors least, meaning that she fears that physical assassin less than the way in which our minds can take us into very scary places. I think sometimes we have to remember that Dickinson, one of the things that makes her poetry so powerful is that she still renders the world very much, and I mean this, I don't mean this in a demeaning way at all. I think one of the things that make our best writers and our best artists and our best poets perennially powerful throughout their lives, no matter how old they are, is that they're still able to see the world as children in the best sense of the word. And here, how many times, even as parents, have we said to ourselves, you know, when a child is scared because of a nightmare, or a child is scared because the lights are out, or they want you to close the closet door. And we as parents, or we are adults, are saying, it's just your imagination. There's nothing really there. But Dickinson is positing that, yes, within that dark imagination, things can be very scary indeed. And this is just all part of the human experience. So again, a very, very powerful poem. Many years ago, I think I gave a paper on this at a New Jersey conference, but it is a pretty interesting poem, especially for this time of year when our imaginations are activated. I think we have time for one more. And I saved this one for the end because I really love this poem. It's a poem where this is not unusual for Dickinson. She's writing about herself as a character, even though she's already dead. She writes a poem famously, I heard a fly buzz when I died. Another one, I felt a funeral in my brain. And she's the subject of the poem from within her own casket. Another one, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. Here she begins, I died for beauty, but was scarce. Notice it's already past tense. So maybe instead of doing it stanza by stanza, maybe someone who hasn't read today would like to read, would read the whole poem top to bottom. Any volunteers?
Yeah, I'll volunteer.
Okay, Abe. No one else is jumping in, so we'll go to our good reader here.
It means it's difficult. I died for beauty, but was scarce adjusted in the tomb, when one who died for truth was lain in an adjoining room. He questioned softly why I failed. For beauty, I replied, and I for truth. The two are one. We brethren are, he said. And so, as kinsmen met at night, we talked between the rooms until the moss had reached our lips and covered up our names.
Thank you, Abe. Thank you.
Oh,
That's strong.
Oh, it's very strong indeed. In fact, I'll have a revelation about this poem at the end. But notice, obviously, what she's describing here is two corpses. She's one of them, and they're not in the ground; they're above ground in what we think of today as crypts or mausoleums. And the phrase scarce is also very interesting, but was scarce. And she attaches that to adjusted in the tomb, meaning perhaps that, you know, they kind of fitted her for the casket. And from what we understand, we don't have any idea about exactly how tall or how heavy she was. The one lithograph we have of her, we can infer perhaps she was probably slight of frame. But that's neither here nor there. The idea is that
it doesn't scarce mean hardly in this.
Well, yes, but I think she's also hardly but I think, but scarce, yeah, hardly, but also I think she loves to play with words in terms of their physical sense as well. You know, when you think of scarcity, you think of like something that it can be very narrow, very slim. You know, the passageway was scarce. You know, we can use it in those respects as well. But then she quickly shifts the focus from herself to her neighbor. When one who died for truth was lain in an adjoining room. So already she's foreshadowing what's going to come. You know, she tells us up front, one who died for truth. And then I would just want you to kind of hold those two words out for a moment, beauty and truth, because I think she has something very specific going on here, which we'll get to in a moment. But so she died for beauty. Her neighbor, who's apparently a male, we'll infer that in just a second, died for truth. And then the very next pronoun gives it to us. He questioned softly why I failed, meaning, you know, what killed you? What did you die of? She puts in quotes, for beauty, I replied. And then almost as though the door is open to share, and I for truth. The two are one. We brethren are, he said. Remember too, in the 19th century, when we often use the term man or mankind, it was inclusive of all gender. Right now, we're more careful about he, she, and things like that for all the obvious reasons. But when he says brethren, it really means that, you know, we are of the same stock. It's not just that, you know, she doesn't mean brethren in terms of just male brothers. It's not about that at all. But then after that little exchange, you know, she says, I died for beauty. And then he reveals, I died for truth. Apparently, a conversation ensues, but we're never going to be privileged to it because the poem isn't long enough. She just adds at the end, and it really whets your appetite. I would love to know what else they talked about. And so as kinsmen met at night, right? It's kind of like suddenly the reasons we died, one for beauty, one for truth, make them create a bond between them, if you will. We talked between the rooms, meaning, you know, there's obviously they're in a crypt, they're in their caskets, they're in a wall, but they're still talking. These corpses are not dead. Going back to the first poem by Poe, the spirits are still very much there. But then she has this very interesting way of landing the poem. Until the moss had reached our lips and covered up our names. I love the way those last two lines make us think about, are we talking about the bodies decomposing in the crypt or in the coffin? And so when they reach their lips, because then that would infer that their physical bodies are still speaking, or is it a grand metaphor? We never really know because there's no evidence for it in the poem. And then covered up our names, which would refer to the way in which, you know, the brush and the moss would start to, you know, we see that sometimes in old cemeteries, right? Where the name on, even on a mausoleum is hard to read. And so she's got all of this going on. But as I just posited, and Phyllis will know this from my daily poem, I used this poem recently in my daily poem thread, and I suggested, as you know, just from my own reading of it, that they never stop talking, because if they're talking while they're dead, the moss reaching their lips, or whatever, the debris covering up their names, this seems to be an ongoing conversation. But it's a wonderful poem because it's one of the poems I describe as her creepy, happy poems about death. Not all of her poems about death, in fact, most of her poems about death are not scary and they're not morbid. They're really about what we've seen in the earlier examples of the way in which she wrestles with the topic. Like in the Poe poem, Mystery of Mysteries, right? One final thing I'd like to posit for you. Some of you may have remembered reading Once Upon a Time, a marvelous poem by John Keats, the great British Romantic poet.
Yes.
And it's called Ode on a Grecian Urn. 5 stanzas, right? Interestingly enough, what is an urn? It's in Keats's time, it's a very elaborate work of art, especially a Grecian urn. And it's also a place where ashes are stored. So the end of that poem, he's going on and on about, you know, how everything that's etched on the urn is frozen in time. And even though that may seem like a bad thing, it's like the lovers are never going to quite meet each other, but they're going to forever be young and forever be in love. And so he celebrates the idea of how fixed the images on the urn are. And then the very last line of the poem, which some of you may be familiar with, and I'll give it to you, you can look it up on your own sometime. The very last line of the poem, which I love, is a chiasmus, meaning that there's like that kind of crossing of lines. And I really believe this is where Dickinson got this idea. She was a big fan. I mean, she knew her Bible inside out. She was also a reader of Shakespeare. She was, these things are mentioned in her letters. She was a big fan of the British Romantic poets who were writing around the time before she was born and when she was a little girl. In fact, William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge are writing the lyrical ballads and prefaces to lyrical ballads in 1798. She's born in 1830. So it should be no surprise that these are very widely read in America. They're also being read by the great transcendentalists. But here's what I'm getting at. The chiasmus she's created here is, there's only one quote from Mr. Keats in this 5-stanza poem that's really a celebration about art and how art freezes things for us forever in the best sense of the word. And the last line is that the urn actually speaks. An impossibility, the inanimate object to whom thou sayest, beauty is truth, truth, beauty. That is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. End of poem. And I think you would have a lot of fun if, I'm not giving anybody any homework, but you would have a lot of fun to revisit that poem by Mr. Keats and then read this poem by Ms. Dickinson and see how the two are connected. I'm quite certain that she chose beauty and truth as an allusion, a beautiful allusion to that masterpiece by John Keats. And that the beauty and the truth continue, just like, again, and is it a coincidence that that's a poem about a Grecian urn? And here she's talking about two corpses having a conversation that goes on and on and on and on, even though we don't know what that was really about. I think that would be quite a stretch if it were a coincidence.
Professor,
yeah.
Professor,
Oh, John, please, it's John here.
John, what maybe she's talking about, and they're both talking about the words on the Grecian urn. Namely, you know, that's all there is to know. She's referring to the quotation on the Grecian urn as being transcendent. It covers generations, it covers decades, eons, and is still applicable to our study. And right. I think that the fact that we're talking about it today is I think it means that.
Right. The fact that we're talking about it before Halloween in 2021 is evidence that it's something important that we continue to think about. And even in this poem, where the thing that makes them brethren, or kinsmen, if you will, is the same thing that Mr. Keats is positing at the end of that poem through the urn, which is that beauty and truth are the same thing. Right? That he makes them synonyms. He makes them equivalents. Beauty is truth, truth, beauty. And I think all of us, especially in today's climate of shall I dare even use the words alternative facts, the absurdity of alternative facts, that there is something indeed beautiful, beyond beautiful, about truth, about reality, about substance, about this we know to be true. And there is no alternative reality. This is the reality that we all agree upon. I think in some ways these poems are more relevant than ever because we just can't make up an alternate world and live in it, and then still be able to function as a society. But I'm delving into polemics here, and I should not be doing that. We'll keep it light and easy. But I think that's a wonderful poem to think about as we approach Halloween, beauty and truth, and the way in which she has a playful and wonderful time with the prospect of death. It does not frighten her. She wrestles with it, as you'd see in some of her other poetry. But I think it's not because she's obsessed with death, or that she's freaked out by death, if you will, but because she finds it such a fascinating subject, as we all do, in our mortal existence, one might say. So I'm happy to hang around, and I know, wow, the time went so fast. Where did it go? 4 poems. Good thing I didn't add a 5th one. Any questions, ideas, thoughts? I'm happy to hear anything you have to say.
What would you have
thing-
added?
Oh,
Sorry, Myra. What would you have added for your 5th poem?
I'm sorry, what would I?
Have added for your
Oh.
5th poem?
Oh, for a 5th poem. My goodness. I mean, there's so many. I would love to have referred to the Raven, but we'd be here all day.
But
We'd literally be here all day. The Raven is not a poem. The Raven is a seminar.
I just love the feeling of after death, that it's sort of optimistic in that
Indeed.
the spirit continues to ponder life and substance, and it's just it leaves one with a good feeling.
I agree. I think that is one of the amazing things that makes Dickinson such a sublime poet, is that whatever subject she's rendering in her poetry, we are, as readers, we're the benefactors of now seeing it in a completely different way. In fact, maybe are there any other comments? I have something.
I have a comment.
Yes, please, Phyllis.
Since 2004, I've learned so much from you. I want to thank you for a wonderful talk today again, as usual. Thank you for
you're
enlightening
very,
us.
very, very, very welcome. This is one of I think I have a lot of wonderful opportunities and moments in my marvelous career as a professor, and being able to share with the community where our university is, and to share these ideas about poetry is, in fact, I'll leave you with I was going to share something by Harold Bloom, but I'll leave you with this thought. Recently, I visited a retired colleague with a bunch of other folks, one of whom was Professor Spriglia, who you all got to meet a few weeks ago, and he did a wonderful job. And my retired colleague, who is a poet, and he's really a wonderful scholar, continues to write, and he's still writing, just published another article in an edited book about Elizabeth Bishop. But he was lamenting the fact, my dear colleague Jeff Gray was lamenting the fact that 78, that at the universities today, the big universities today, that once upon a time, we used to have these entire seminars at the grad level that talked about nothing but poetry. And that today, it seems as though people have moved entirely to narrative, right? Which is fine. Nobody's against reading Moby Dick or The Great Gatsby or some of the great stories, right? But at the same time, I'm very pleased to be one of the holdouts, the standouts, who is literally at this semester teaching a graduate course in American poetry and having taught an undergraduate course all in American poetry. So I think, with all respect to my colleague, that he's right in some respect, but in another respect, poetry is alive and well. Poetry is alive and well. And I depend on you folks to put that up.
Professor,
Yes.
I think that one of the things that I learned was that when you can't say it in prose, you say it in poetry.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be that much more powerful as a result of it. But the trouble is, few people read poetry. in comparison to prose.
Yeah, and the less we read poetry, of course, the harder it becomes to read, because poetry is like an intellectual muscle. It's a creative muscle. We have to keep exercising it to be able to read well. But yes, but no, that excellent comment. So again, I am very grateful for this opportunity. My pumpkin and my black cat, the monolith, and I wish you all a delightful, safe, and not so scary Halloween. And I look forward to the next opportunity, hopefully in person. We'll see how things go.
Oh,
Right?
great. Great.
Okay,
Thank you
great.
so
Thank
much.
you.
So much.
That's
Thank you.
Thank
wonderful.
you to Michael for
Thank you.
facilitating. Phyllis,
And to
we
remind
wouldn't
everyone-
be here without you.
And to remind everyone, next week, Laura will be back with Assemblywoman Mila J.C. She'll be our next speaker.
Oh,
But,
yeah.
that,
Okay.
until then, have a good Halloween. We'll see you next time.
Same to you,
Happy
Michael.
Halloween,
Okay,
everyone.
Thank
Good to
you.
see you.
God bless.
Boo. Boo.